Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about an incredibly exciting company with a tremendous potential to change the treatment and survival of patients with pancreatic cancer, as well as build a tremendous company that delivers value for shareholders. Immunovia is focused on one thing, and that is saving lives through early detection of pancreatic cancer. Throughout this presentation, I hope to share with you information that makes it clear that we are a small company with very big ambitions and a very big opportunity. We are a diagnostics company, and as I said, we are focused exclusively on meeting the market's unmet need for early detection of pancreatic cancer. Why does it make sense to consider an investment in Immunovia? We start with a large total addressable market. There is a significant unmet need for a simple blood test that can detect pancreatic cancer. The company has developed a high-performance blood test. We have completed development of that test, and we have proven its accuracy in detecting stage 1 and stage 2 pancreatic cancer. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's so important. We have 2 clinical validation studies that have been completed. We also have a pipeline of additional studies that we are working on, which will be really critical for securing payer reimbursement, both from government payers as well as private insurance companies in our lead market, which is the United States. I'll talk a little bit about our team today, which is a small team that is filled with experts in bringing a product like this to market and successfully driving adoption and penetration following launch. It's also a team that has shown an ability to deliver on its commitments. Many of you may be familiar with the history of Immunovia. We are a company that has been around since 2007. Throughout that time, there were definitely periods where the company had very high commitments. The company communicated aspiring goals and failed to deliver. Over the last 2 years, we have changed that. The company is now a very different company. It's a very lean, very small, very agile, and highly productive company. And the team that we've put together is the real driver for that. From an investor's perspective, if you think about a test like this and a product like this, part of what you want to know is not just that there is a clinical need for the test, but that the economics are compelling as well, that we can generate good revenue with each test, that we can generate a strong gross margin with each test, and that we can drive volume. One of the real advantages for us is that this is a test that is done every year for people who are at high risk for pancreatic cancer. So it creates an opportunity where you have a high margin product with the potential for a recurring revenue stream. Finally, we'll talk a little bit about why the company is an attractive investment now based on our valuation, the assets that we have, as well as the milestones that are coming up. As I mentioned, there's a significant unmet need in pancreatic cancer. Pancreatic cancer is the 3rd leading cause of cancer deaths, both in the United States as well as in Europe. And the reason for that is this low survival rate. You can see on the right-hand side of the slide, of those people who get pancreatic cancer, only 13% of them survive for 5 years. Why is that? It's very simple. Pancreatic cancer doesn't have a lot of obvious signs and symptoms. As a result, 4 out of 5 people who get diagnosed with pancreatic cancer are diagnosed at stage 3 and 4. By then, surgery is no longer an option, and the survival rate is an awful 3%. Conversely, if we can find that pancreatic cancer early, if we can diagnose it at stage 1 or stage 2, the survival rate jumps to at least 44%. And our leading centers are delivering survival rates that exceeds 70% for those diagnosed at stage 1 and 2. So there's this tremendous need for early diagnosis of pancreatic cancer to drive better survival. As we think about the market size, I mentioned this is a very large total addressable market. And the reason for that is that there are a large number of people who are at risk for pancreatic cancer. You see here on the slide some of the clinical factors that can put a person at risk for pancreatic cancer. In some cases, it's a family history of pancreatic cancer. For others, it's genetic mutations that make it more likely that they can develop pancreatic cancer over time. People who have new onset diabetes, that is, people who get diagnosed with diabetes later in life, have an 8 times higher incidence of pancreatic cancer than the general population. And then there are also some factors like pancreatitis, as well as pancreatic cysts, that can lead to this need for ongoing monitoring and ongoing surveillance to see if that patient develops pancreatic cancer. In total, this is a market of 1.8 million people in the US, which, as I mentioned, is Immunovia's first market. In order to capitalize on this opportunity, we have to have a test that performs. Immunovia has developed PancreaSure, which is a simple blood test. It can be administered in the office. And in a large clinical study of well over 1,000 patients, we showed that we could detect pancreatic cancer in 78% of the people who had stage 1 and 2 disease. That's what we call sensitivity, that ability to find cancer when it's there. At the same time, we were also able to show that PancreaSure is very good at not sending false signals. So when we looked at patients who did not have pancreatic cancer, but they were those people who are at high risk, what we found was that 94% of the time, the PancreaSure test correctly identified those patients as being free of cancer. We have all these people who are at high risk, and one of the challenges is that we don't have great ways to monitor them to see if they're developing pancreatic cancer. Today, the standard of care is using one of 3 types of imaging techniques. Endoscopic ultrasound is a very invasive procedure in which a patient undergoes a procedure under anesthesia where a camera is inserted through their mouth and down into the place where in the stomach that they can see the pancreas from there. Other physicians will use MRI or CT. What you can see, though, is that when you look at those same measures of accuracy, when you look at sensitivity, when you look at specificity, the performance of these imaging techniques is not where it needs to be. Endoscopic ultrasound is very effective at finding cancer when it's there, but it's not very specific. MRI is not very sensitive, meaning it doesn't find about half the cancers that are there. Similarly, with CT, we see the same kind of limitations. When you compare that to the results that we saw from the Clarity study with the PancreaSure test, you can see we've got 78% sensitivity and specificity of 94%. Those figures compare very favorably with the imaging techniques. On the specificity front, we beat all of these different techniques. And if you think about it from a patient's perspective, what would you rather do? Would you rather undergo imaging, or would you rather have a simple blood test? Undergo a procedure where you need to go to the hospital to have it done, maybe put under anesthesia, or a simple blood test that can be done in a doctor's office. In addition to the Clarity study, we did a second study called Verify. That study was quite a bit smaller, but it was also successful. We achieved the primary endpoint and showed similar sensitivity of 77%. The specificity was a little bit lower. In that study, we introduced some additional risk groups beyond what was focused on in the Clarity study, which was primarily that group that has family history or genetic mutations that put them at risk. One of the things that's very exciting is that when you combine the data from the different studies that we've done, you can see that across different types of high-risk groups, you see very consistent sensitivity and very consistent specificity, high performance on both of those measures of accuracy. The development of this test and the clinical validation of this test is the result of the hard work of the team that you see here. This is our leadership team at Immunovia. It is primarily made up of people who have joined the company within the last 2 to 3 years, although we do have Tom King, our medical director, who provides that history with Immunovia. I could tell you a lot about the background of these individuals, but I think probably the most important thing to know is that these people have delivered. Maybe the best example of that is the fact that this team developed the PancreaSure test going from discovery to clinical validation in just 2 years. This is something that normally takes much longer. If you look back at the history, for example, of Immunovia, it took years and years to get to this point. This team did it in just about 2 years. Finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about Immunovia as an investment. We've talked about the fact that there is a large unmet need. There's a large market for these high-risk individuals. They are eager for something that allows them to look for cancer without being so invasive. We've talked about the fact that our test, PancreaSure, delivers against that need. But what about the company is in? I think there are 3 things that I'd like to share with you. The first is that our valuation as a company is very attractive. Transparently, I wish our market share or market capitalization and our share price was much higher than what it is. But I would say to those of you who are not Immunovia investors today, the valuation of the company today at just under 70 million Swedish krona provides a tremendous opportunity to enter the stock and to take advantage of the fact that we have a number of valuable assets and that we have several upcoming catalysts. What are those valuable assets? Well, the most obvious is this pancreatic cancer test that we have developed. The second is the fact that we've successfully validated that test in 2 different independent clinical studies. The third thing is that because of our long history in the pancreatic cancer space, we have very strong relationships with the thought leaders in this space, and we have been able to partner with them on a good portfolio of clinical studies. Those clinical studies are underway now and will help us to secure reimbursement for the test after we launch in the 3rd quarter of 2025. Finally, we have a fully operational CLIA accredited lab. For those of you who might not be familiar, CLIA is the regulatory framework for regulating lab-developed tests in the United States. It is a fairly long and difficult process in order to get a lab credentialed as CLIA accredited. We've gone through that process and we are now ready to move forward with the launch of our test in the 3rd quarter of 2025. And that really is the first catalyst that I would point to. If you think about what are the ways that the market may react to Immunovia in the coming years. The second piece is that all those clinical studies that I mentioned will be reading out throughout 2025 and 26. Those clinical study results could provide a positive catalyst for the stock as well. I would also point to the fact that we're actively pursuing a commercial collaboration partner. I mentioned the fact that we're going to be launching the test in the 3rd quarter of 2025. When we do that, we will initially launch on our own in a very targeted way, but over time, our goal is to bring on a larger diagnostics company that can really help us to capitalize on the full potential, the full opportunity of the PancreaSure test. And then finally, as we think about reimbursement and getting paid for the tests that we do, either by government payers or by private commercial insurers in the United States, we believe that that reimbursement will happen in the second half of 2026, and we see that as a further catalyst for the stock. So in short, Immunovia is a company that is targeting a very large market where there's a significant unmet need. We have a high performance product. That product will be launched in the third quarter of 2025 in the United States. Once we do, we expect that product to have compelling economics, partially because of the price of the test that we can secure, partially because of the fact that this will be a recurring revenue test. This is not a test that's done one time. All of those high-risk individuals would be tested on a recurring annual basis. And because of that, we see tremendous opportunity to change the market for pancreatic cancer early detection and a tremendous opportunity to create shareholder value. So thanks very much for listening to the presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Jeff. It's very interesting. It seems that finding the proper patients is really one of the keys to success here. So what are the inclusion criteria? I mean, you mentioned, for instance, diabetes and some other diseases as sort of marking a person as a high-risk individual. And I guess this ties into remuneration and reimbursement as well. I mean, if you want to get a reimbursement for a test, then I suppose you have to have a well-defined target audience that would be eligible for this. So could you tell us a little bit more about the inclusion on the criteria for being a candidate for this pancreatic tests?
Sure. So our initial focus is on those individuals, those 600,000 individuals in the United States who have a family history of pancreatic cancer or who have genetic mutations that put them at risk. That was the primary focus of the Clarity study. However, there were a number of patients in that Clarity study who had other health challenges as well that put them at risk. There were a high percentage of diabetes patients. More than a third of the patients in that Clarity study also had pancreatic cysts, which are essentially fluid-like sacs that grow on the pancreas that sometimes develop into pancreatic cancer. So while our initial focus is on that family and genetic risk group, the reality is that between the Clarity study and the Verify study, we've already generated data, as I shared, in some of those other risk groups. Specifically, most importantly, and right at this point, is the group that has pancreatic cysts, and we're starting to build out the data in those people that have diabetes. We'll be looking at that further in an upcoming study this year.
Right. Very interesting. And reimbursement is sometime 2026, Medicare. Do you have other discussions with private insurers that might yield results earlier than that?
Yeah, I think it's possible. I think, Medicare is our primary focus just because Medicare insures all of those individuals over the age of 65 in the United States. So it becomes really important to us. More than half of our patients who do the test will be on Medicare. But having said that, we are already starting to have conversations with those private payers, those commercial insurance companies, to identify those that would be willing to work with us and provide reimbursement earlier. In fact, not long after we get off this call, I jump on a plane and fly to a conference where we'll be meeting with medical directors from different commercial insurance companies. And so we've certainly see an opportunity there as well. And one of the things that can be really interesting is that some of those insurers are willing to provide what's called coverage with evidence development. What that means is that maybe they don't believe that you quite have enough reimbursement, or I'm sorry, enough clinical data to give you full reimbursement right away, but they're willing to say, we see real potential here. We want to conduct a study with you. While that study is going on, we're going to reimburse you for the test. That's obviously a double win for us. We get reimbursed for the test, and we also get to build more clinical data as well.
That sounds very interesting. Do you have any sort of projections on what the cost would be for the test? This is a question from the audience.
Yeah, so we haven't disclosed that in detail yet. We are still working through some of the details, but in a broad overview, what I can say is this. We believe that the price of this test, when it's reimbursed, will be about $900. That's based on our experience with our first generation test, IMMray PanCan-d. When you think about the cost for us to produce the test, we believe that we can generate gross margins that are in the range of 70% or greater initially. And obviously, we hope to reduce that over time and expect to reduce that over time as volume grows and we look at different ways to reduce costs.
Perfect. You mentioned 600,000 patients in the US. Looking at the rest of the world, and I guess in particular Europe, is it roughly the same market size in terms of patients?
It is. It's strikingly similar how close the two markets are, the US and Europe, in terms of size. There's also a large opportunity in Asia as well. I would say that if you look at different regions around the world, there are some countries in Asia, specifically Korea, Japan, and China, where those countries are really thinking very proactively about early cancer detection. And so those are potentially attractive markets for us as well.
Right. And do you have any idea about perhaps when your tests would be commercially available in other regions outside the US?
I would say that our first focus is certainly in the US. I think that realistically, those Asian markets may be something that could be a more near-term opportunity because of the fact that within those markets, you have diagnostics companies that are very used to partnering to bring technology into those markets. We could do that in a way that wouldn't require a lot of investment from us, wouldn't require capital outlays and building a large team. So, those are things that we're certainly looking at opportunistically.
Sounds exciting. But the US, as you mentioned, is the biggest market and it's the closest one. So one step at a time.
Exactly.
I believe that's, and speaking of time, we've just run out of it. So thank you very much for your presentation, Jeff, and have a good journey to the conference.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.